Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We are so excited to have you with us today and really excited about who our guest is today. But before we
Yes.
get to that, any announcements today, Laura?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are still taking listener stories and listener questions that we can incorporate into this podcast. So if you are interested in sharing your story about purity culture, it can be totally anonymous. We will always make sure that any identifying information will be taken out. You can head to our website, sundayschooldropoutspod.com/voicemail or connect. You can write your story. You can leave it as a voice note. You can ask us questions there or through DMs. We want to hear from you. We've had some really powerful listener stories that have been like a part of these episodes. And I think it just does such a great job at bringing it home of recognizing like purity culture was so destructive in so many different ways. And it helps to hear other people's voices. It helps us know that we're not alone. So we are going to be playing these the entire season. And so we would love for you to participate in them. We'll have everything in the show notes. If you want to just click the link there, it'll take you straight to the voicemail page and you can leave your story as well.
So as usual, just want to say our brief disclaimer. That is, we recognize that some of the topics we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that may require more processing or be too much to handle right now. Please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience, so take what you need and leave what you don't.
The long-term impacts of purity culture have been substantial. I was in the heart of it when I was young, and I went through a lot when I wasn't so pure, and they made pretty much a public display of it. I didn't live it down forever. I was always shamed, and then I carried the shame myself. So even to this day, so I was in the church for over 30 years, and I'm 49 now, and I've left the church a while ago, but I definitely have the impacts of purity culture. I'm still trying to be in my body, listen to my body, even just my views about sex outside of marriage, and even masturbating, just because we were told that it was wrong. Anyways, lots of effects, lots of long-term effects, trying to heal, trying to deconstruct. It's definitely a journey. I was 17 when I lost my virginity. Went to a Christian school, which was part of the church as well. And because of my decision to have sex, I guess essentially I got caught, sort of thing, but my life was never the same. I was shamed in more ways than you can imagine, from not being allowed to attend a mission trip to needing counseling and attending Bible studies. I had to write a letter to the boy, the guy that I had sex with, and read it in front of people. I had to tell in detail every moment, pretty much, of our sexual encounter. This was in front of my parents, so my youth pastor and her husband. The impact of it was like, it's so much trauma, but I just didn't realize it because I wanted to be pure. The purity culture teaches you that this is what you want. This is how you are awesome. And I wanted to be awesome. I just want to say that the impact has been a lifetime of trying to unravel mindsets, things about relationships, mostly about sex. I feel like even relationally and when it comes to trust, I really just don't have it. And a lot of that mistrust is within myself. So, trying to unravel the effects of purity culture has been incredible and difficult. And I go through almost stages of grief, like anger and sadness, and you literally grieve those years that you could have had a quote-unquote normal life. So when I do get angry, I really would like to speak up, and I've considered it and wondering how and what different ways, just to even help people that I've known, hundreds of people that have grown up in that church and in that environment, just how they could probably heal too. They have stories too.
All right. So it is time for some questions from some of our listeners. First one, let's see here. How do I talk to a partner who was also raised in purity culture, but they're still in it?
Ooh, that's interesting.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I feel like I've had clients where this has been the case to some extent. So, it's hard because I think anytime we're talking about, spiritual things, religious things, faith-based things, it's very easy to feel offended very easily, right? Because we're talking about something that is very dear to us, part of our identity, things like that. And so if you're somebody where you've been deconstructing from purity culture or understanding the impacts of it, you're trying to talk to your partner, sometimes it's like the conversation already feels set up to maybe go sideways because we're talking about a real identity piece. And so, what I might encourage you to do is really keep it focused on me, my experience, the way that I felt, the impact on me, staying away from some of the blame pieces. That's where we might get into trouble, or where people might feel like they need to defend themselves. And so, if there's space to share your own stories without saying, like criticizing church or purity culture in general, another thing you could also do is have maybe a conversation with your partner to begin with to say, hey, I have some things that I want to talk to you about. I know that it might be really sensitive because this is something that is still important to you. Would you feel okay if I shared these things with you, or the impacts of these things, or maybe how this might impact our relationship? And would it be okay to have a conversation about this? And that might be enough to kind of give them a heads up that you're wanting to talk about your experience more than say bashing their faith or their values or things like that. Yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me. Andrew, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I really just agree with what you said. I think focusing it around your experience, what you're feeling, making I statements, it's definitely a therapy phrase, I statements, but I think that's very useful and important because, yeah, certainly it's understandable. Folks are just going to probably get defensive if the way you come into it is this belief that still is meaningful to you is really harmful, and this is why I don't like it, and this is why you're wrong. And that's obviously not going to be the best way forward if we are wanting to have a good faith conversation where we are actually hearing each other. So I think what you said, that is, there is no easy, perfect answer to this, but I think that is the best way forward.
Yeah. And I also think too, sometimes when things impact us, in this case, purity culture, it may require that there's some shifts in your relationship. And again, it can feel really sticky if one person is still kind of in it and the other person isn't. And so I always encourage people to kind of take it outside of the parameters of purity culture and to say hey, in my own journey of healing, or as I've been reflecting, or things like that, would it be possible to start having some conversations around expectations or roles, or how we are engaging in different things together, and really trying to view it as a conversation, and maybe even pull some of the spiritual or faith-based purity culture pieces out of it, and to just kind of frame it as as we grow in our relationship, as we get used to each other, as we become, different people, or older, or we have kids, or whatever it is, can we just have this as part of our, what we talk about, a conversation that's on the table, so that we're checking in with one another. And sometimes that can help to diffuse some of the intense emotions around it that might be connected to their faith, that again might bring on a sense of defensive-ness. So that comes to mind as well.
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. All right. We have another question. This is a big one. A listener asks, where do I even begin healing from purity culture? I don't know. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a good question. I do very immediately have an answer in my mind, and it may be a little surprising.
Yeah,
maybe.
I'm curious.
Really, my thing is when it comes to healing from purity culture, I'm as a therapist and a coach, I'm looking at what actually what has purity culture done that has caused harm. And in most cases, it has told us that we cannot trust our bodies and that our bodies are not our own. So where I would actually start is any kind of whether it's yoga, stretching, working out, or just doing a body scan. Like, I would start with any kind of practice that is bringing you in touch with your physical body, not in the context of sex, not in the context of anything that's like really charged or really heavy or potentially like triggering in a way that might be overwhelming. Like, Peter Levine does some really good work on this. So like that really, really short little, almost like a pamphlet sized book called Healing Trauma that he has. You can find it in most major bookstores. Like, for example, that's a good place to start. Or I have a deck of cards. I actually have it right here. That is yoga deck.
Nice.
Now, like something like this, like where you pull a card out, it's a pose. It'll tell you the name, how to do it. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Something like that. Anything that just gets you in touch with your body. Like, it really is that simple. And I like to break things down to like the smallest, most accessible building block that I can. I know purity culture, for a lot of us, we go to things about modesty, sexuality, all of those things, but it really is as simple as your body is good and it is yours and you can trust it, and let's start building that relationship from the ground up. And that just starts with even knowing what it feels like. The most basic level.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think that we are often so inclined to like rush into the opposite of what purity culture taught. So if purity culture said, I should dress like this, or I shouldn't do this, or I should do this, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to just do the opposite and consider that healing from purity culture. And maybe that is, but oftentimes we're just doing the same thing, just on the other side of the spectrum. And that doesn't necessarily equate to healing, because you're just doing the opposite of what was done before. But also that can sometimes be really triggering or even re-traumatizing to your body, right? So if you grew up believing like no sex before marriage, and then you all of a sudden swing to the other side of the spectrum and you are having, sex with random people or risky sex or things like that, that's not a judgment on it. But sometimes our bodies might experience that as too much, right? Because we've been so suppressed, or we've been so confined for such a long time. And so I think a lot of people that I've worked with are like, okay, I just have to do the opposite of what purity culture is taught, and then I will be healed. And I would say maybe it's like you have to figure out what's right for you, for sure. But also this sounds weird, but it also goes with what you're saying, Andrew, of like, give yourself permission to go slow. So, like you don't have to go do all these things or wear these things or become this sort of person overnight. Like, give yourself permission to go slow, to understand, how did purity culture impact me? How do I get in touch with my body? Because like, I remember whenever I realized, hey, purity culture isn't all it's cracked up to be, I'm like, great, I'm going to go wear all the V-neck t-shirts, which is totally fine. But I felt so guilty or shameful or hypervigilant while I was wearing them, because I hadn't done that embodiment work of understanding how purity culture was still deeply embodied in me. So, I remember being on a podcast probably a couple of years ago now, and they're like, what would you tell somebody who's like wanting to go out and have fun and have sexual partners and whatever? I'm like, hey, go at your own pace, but just like take a break for a little bit. Like, give yourself some time to really like slow down, understand how purity culture has impacted you specifically, and do some body work around that, some self-compassion work around that, some shame resiliency work around that, just so that you're not having to like fight against yourself as you're developing this new non-purity culture identity and practices.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Going slow, I think I can't overstate how important that is.
Yeah. I always tell my clients, we go slow at first so that we can go faster in the future. And when we go at the pace of our nervous system, it means we're not going to go too fast, but we're also not going to go too slow. We will go at your pace. And that's where I think we start to see the most amount of progress, because our body is able to metabolize what is happening and create a new normal or a new baseline for us, which allows us to then expand even more into different ways of life and thought and practice. So, yeah.
Yeah. Here is one of our listener stories. Purity culture still remains one of the most complex and deeply ingrained traumas I've ever experienced. And I've been in a mass shooting. It's subtle indoctrination day after day until you have no idea who you are or want to be. I recognized that was the entire point, but it worked. I remember a specific instance where I worked at a Christian summer camp and we had 7 a.m. staff meetings every morning, and in front of everyone, counselors, the nurses, the directors, everyone, I was called out for wearing my pajama pants. It was, quote, inappropriate for me to wear them in front of men because it made them think of me in bed and is a stumbling block in their walk with Christ. Mind you, these were camp-issued flannel plaid pajama pants that half the staff in the room were wearing. I was 15. Not only have I never worn a pair of plaid pajama pants again, that was a defining moment for me. I knew in that moment that I was a whore. There was no way around it. My existence and those stupid pajamas was all my fault. And I felt such shame, not only being called out like that, but for not thinking of it myself. I felt like such a failure. How could I have not known it would cause my friends to stumble? It hurts to this day, and it's been 20 years. One of the only male friends I have from those days always says, "Y'all didn't even have time to brush your teeth, and I was up until 4 a.m. with homesick campers. I didn't even know you entered a room because I was so tired." And it's true, those things are so ridiculous, but the impact is lasting. And that's just one story of so many. I believed I was a whore for years because of my stupid pajamas. They were comfy too.
Wow. Oh my gosh. My heart is just like so with this person because I feel like it just resonates so deeply. Like maybe some people didn't wear the pajama pants, but like that is such a common situation. And like to hold that in your body, the shame of that, I can remember that of like just not trying to do anything other than being like, upright and appropriate. And some person subjectively says like, this is not okay. And it just can make you crumble inside. And yeah, such a defining moment.
Yeah.
And I just like want to go back to that, 15-year-old girl and like look at her and be like, they're wrong. Like, I know this is really hard, like, but they are wrong. You don't have to listen to them. Like, you are okay. Wear those comfortable pajama pants, like, the double standards. It's just like, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and as me, being out of these systems for as long as I have been and hearing stories like that, it honestly just makes me angry because it's like, this person's been led to believe they did something horribly wrong. But what's, really happening here is like, okay, there's a bunch of grown ass men sexualizing a 15-year-old and making it her responsibility. Like, fuck that.
Yeah.
Like, that is so inappropriate. Like, you guys need to go to therapy or something, but it is not the 15-year-old's fault or responsibility or job to have, to manage your issues for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
it's disgusting.
Yeah.
And I remember hearing things like that as a woman, like you don't ever want to wear like your pajamas, like pajama pants or anything related to that, because that will cause men to think of you in this way. You don't want to come out with wet hair because that will cause men to think that you were just in the shower and then they'll picture you in the shower. You don't want to ever lay down in front of men because that will get them thinking about you laying on a bed and what they could do with you. You don't want to sit with your legs open because that will get you like all of these things to like police and control women's bodies. And also, like, really think lowly of men, like that they would have no ability to control themselves because, you have wet hair or whatever. It is so prevalent. I wish I didn't, like, know these stories, but, like, I remember things like that happening to me, to my clients, to my friends. Like, it's really messed up. Really messed up.
Today on the Sunday School Dropouts podcast, we are honored to welcome Willow, whose journey is a powerful testament to resilience, transformation, and the courage to dismantle harmful narratives. Raised in a high-control fundamentalist household where fear and repression were the norm, Willow navigated the challenges of growing up queer in an environment that left little room for her identity to thrive. Her spiritual path has been rich and varied, moving from evangelicalism to independent Anglicanism, then the Episcopal Church, and ultimately becoming a confirmed Roman Catholic. Along the way, she confronted the painful realities of the Catholic abuse crisis, which deepened her commitment to justice and strengthened her trust in her own moral and spiritual discernment. Willow's story is one of embracing openness and authenticity over fear and repression, a journey that fuels her passion for healing and sex positivity beyond purity culture.
With advanced degrees in theology, psychology, and Catholic studies, and as a certified trauma professional, Willow dedicates her work to supporting the LGBTQ plus individuals, survivors of abuse, and those emerging from purity culture and conversion practices. Her approach blends humanistic and mindfulness coaching with deep compassion, creating safe spaces for healing and authentic connection. When she's not advocating for justice and transformation, Willow enjoys hiking, indoor climbing, and diving into dystopian literature and critical theory. Today, she'll share her insights on the language of purity culture and how to reclaim sexuality and spirituality in ways that celebrate full human aliveness. Get ready for a conversation that is honest, hopeful, and deeply human. Welcome, Willow, to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It is so good to have you here.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you all.
Yes, I'm really excited because, we're talking about purity culture this season on Sunday School Dropouts, and we have so many different aspects of purity culture that we're hitting on. Even in this conversation today, we have a variety of things that we're hitting on. But I think you are maybe the first person that we're talking to about purity culture and Catholicism. Like, we've talked about it a lot in evangelical context, but not necessarily in, Catholic spaces, Anglican spaces. And so I wondered if you would just kind of give us an overview of like, how does purity culture show up in those spaces? And if you feel like sharing some of your own experiences, we'd love to hear those too.
Yeah, sounds great. So having spent time in the evangelical world and then later in the Catholic world, one of the things I have to say is that they almost feel almost like different religions. And that's primarily because of their understanding of authority and the nature of how one comes to understand their faith, the Bible, and things like that. So to summarize, the big difference is that Catholics, and to some extent in the history of Protestant Anglicans, but Catholics for sure, have this entire body of authoritative teaching that is not just scripture, but it's also the catechism of the Catholic Church. It's also the code of canon law. There's special kinds of writings that the church has in various different ways declared as being kind of special in their own way. So the entire writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, or letters written by popes like encyclicals also have this level of teaching authority. So we'd call that entire body of work the magisterium. We'd call that magisterial teaching. And so what's different about purity culture and things like, what counts as promiscuity, what counts as sexual morality and sexual ethics is not just somebody picking up the Bible like a Protestant might and say, well, let me interpret, these verses about looking with lust and plucking your eye out, or the marriage bed needs to be undefiled, that kind of thing. Rather than somebody just kind of picking up the Bible and deciding what they believe it to mean, the Catholic Church has its magisterial interpretation of Scripture as well. So obviously, the practice of the everyday Catholic versus the official teaching that they're sort of supposed to be following is going to be different. So if there are Catholics listening and saying, hey, I don't know that I believe that, that's fine. Or you might know some Catholics that don't, interact with their faith that way. But there is this really different thing about what's officially on the books, as it were. And really everything that we're talking about with purity culture that I'll be talking about today is through that lens of what does the magisterium say about those particular topics. So that's really the big key difference.
Yes. Okay. That makes so much sense. And I appreciate that clarification because, that is very different. Although I know there's other high control religions, I think about Mormonism, for instance, where they have the Bible, but then they also have, the writings of Joseph Smith. And so it sounds like there's similarities there. I mean, I know you, Andrew, with, Seventh-day Adventists, and is it Ellen White? And is that her name? And like those teachings. So it's like the addition to, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Like a lot of nuance with Ellen White's teachings and them still being authoritative, even though they're not scripture. And so. Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, I'm curious. Also, just knowing that Catholic theology has some of its own unique teachings around things such as chastity and celibacy, things that you don't. Well, celibacy certainly in the case of clergy, you don't really hear that as much in Protestant circles. But I'm just curious, how do you see these intersecting with just the broader concept of purity culture?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's particular to Catholicism is that, just as sort of a very Western type of faith, the kind of Catholic churches that we see around us. So obviously the Catholic Church is made up of several other types of autonomous churches within it. But the one that we think of, the sort of the Roman rite of the Catholic Church that we're used to seeing, the ones that don't look like the Eastern Orthodox, the ones that look like what you're used to seeing on TV and things like that, or depicted in popular culture. That particular way of doing Catholicism, that we might say, is very, very focused on having a lot of rules that can be looked at in a very specific way that you can kind of rule on things. In fact, there is this thing called canon law, church law. And so you can really pick things apart and really get into the nitty-gritty of what a word can mean versus what it might not mean. And so I think that's actually helpful in talking about purity culture, because the Catholic Church does give its adherents very specific definitions. So if you are a Catholic or familiar with the Catholic Church, their big book about teachings that's collected is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or sometimes abbreviated as the CCC. In paragraph 2360 onward, there's all kinds of teachings about sexuality and sexual ethics. So you mentioned a few of those particular words. So that one word is chastity. The way that the Catholic Church defines chastity is integrity, virtue, and self-mastery. So depending on what your state in life is, whether you are married or a priest, to be chaste is to be doing what you should be doing in terms of sex, right? So if you're a priest, to be chaste is to not be having sex. And if you are married, to be chaste would be to be doing sex in a Catholic-approved way. So that's the one kind of thing about that word. Continence is another word that's used a lot. Continence is just the abstaining from sex. So a priest would need to be continent their whole life. There might be times where a married couple, if they're practicing natural family planning, where they might be continent for a particular period of time if they are avoiding a pregnancy. And then celibacy, of course, is the discipline, would be the proper term there, of remaining unmarried and therefore being continent in that sort of station of life. The Catholic Church thinks of celibacy in that particular term as being a state in life and not just sort of a holding tank until you decide or you discern into ministry or into married life. But celibacy is really thought of as a calling, which is sort of interesting. Because celibacy is thought of as a calling, it means that not everybody goes there. Not everybody has, by default, a calling to celibacy or a celibate life, which is sort of interesting, of course, thinking about purity culture, where some people will get to be told, you don't get to get married, right? So by default, are they called to celibacy? Even though not everybody is called to celibacy, nor are they by default called to celibacy, though they may be, according to the church, called to continence and chastity. It's an interesting question. But I think why that matters is because of how the church then defines its teaching around sex in general. But I guess if we want to talk about some of those definitions there, to throw those out there.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting because, purity culture in evangelical spaces, like foundationally is like no sex before marriage. And then, of course, there's always these other rules, and interpretations and what is purity and like all these things. Are there specific things about, like sex or engaging in sexual activity before marriage? Is marriage kind of this one sanctioned, institute where sex is allowed? Or how does the Catholic Church view that?
Yeah. So even within the context of a Catholic marriage, either a natural marriage or a sacramental marriage, it's not super worth getting into those definitions, but the idea is people who are not married in a Catholic church, to put it very simply, could still be married sort of rightly in the eyes of God. It's a natural marriage. And of course, a sacramental marriage is when the church is kind of putting its stamp of approval on it, which can happen after, say, a Protestant has this natural marriage and then becomes a Catholic. Anyways, what's important to know about what is okay for Catholics to do is based on very particularly the Catholic teaching of sexual ethics involving this dual end of sexual relations. What is this dual end of sexual relations? Well, it is this idea that all sexual activity needs to be oriented towards both procreation and also the unitive bond between the two spouses. So unitivity and procreation are the two things that matter. And between those spouses, right? So that the church is saying if you are not a spouse, you can't be doing this unitive thing. But also that includes prohibitions for spouses as well. I know we talked about what kind of language can we use. I'm just going to use the adult words for some of these things then, because that's allowed here. So according to the Catholic teaching, every sexual act that finishes, right? So the ejaculation of a male penis needs to be doing something that relates to that procreative end. So essentially what that means, what we can narrow that down is, if a guy is finishing, it needs to be inside a vagina. If it is not that, it's not actually cool in the eyes of the Catholic Church. And that opens us up to several things. We'll talk, for one, about what that needs to look like according to Catholics, and then two, the other side of how this relates to purity culture. So the one side is that duality, because it has to be maintained together, means that a sacramentally married, a cisgender man, cisgender woman, if they have oral sex and the man finishes, that's actually not cool in the eyes of the church.
Interesting.
And so let me be very clear about something when I say not cool, right? Because sometimes when people talk about these things, there's, again, very specific Catholic language about this. So by not cool, what I mean is that the Catholic Church views, that kind of sex that isn't just P&V, cisgender man, cisgender woman sex, as being what's called grave matter, which is what's only one part of mortal sin. We're probably familiar with this concept.
Yes.
Mortal sin is actually there's a higher barrier to entry than just a really bad thing. So it involves grave matter, which is like a very bad thing. And so the act of engaging in sex that does not lead to the procreative and unitive end is grave matter. But it also has to be committed with the full knowledge of the act's offensiveness and with the full and deliberate consent of the will. So this is one of those funny things where a Catholic could say, well, a Catholic could justify, say, pornography usage. And obviously I'm not saying all porn is bad. I'm just saying from a Catholic perspective, porn use would be bad. But one could say, well, I'm not committing mortal sin, even though this might be grave matter, because I don't know that I'm fully aware of just how bad this act's offensiveness is. So there's a sense that people can find ways of sort of getting out of a mortal sin, even if they're committing grave matter, because it's only one part of it. So there's a sense in which people can get around some of that. But then there's this other side of purity culture that comes through these hyper-specific definitions, what a lot of people call scrupulosity. And that's really about saying, does somebody cross the boundaries in some particular way? You could imagine somebody who's got a very big heart and is wanting to do what's right, and they are, quote unquote, tempted, by pornography or something like that. And so they're they don't think they should be doing this, but they're a human being and they have urges and things like that. And so that third part, the full and deliberate consent of the will, they're like, well, did I fully consent to watching porn? Do I need to go to confession? If I go take the Eucharist on Sunday, am I going to hell? And the scrupulosity takes over, because there are so many ways that you can worm your way into these very specific niche legal definitions of things that can cause people to, develop OCD later in life. They can develop the, trauma from just the idea of thinking about some of these things that they might later decide, say, if they leave or deconstruct, might be some morally neutral, right, for them.
Yeah.
But because that's so connected to these sorts of trauma responses that are related to, is this a sin? And if it is a sin, they need to go to confession. And who knows, maybe they've had traumatic experiences in confession that make basically that whole chain of actions something that's very, very bad for them, at this psychosocial, emotional, chemical level. And so that's sort of this fun thing to define there, that we have this dual end. You have to do sex in a very specific way for it to count. So obviously, gay sex is not allowed. But again, even things that Protestants, for instance, might find acceptable are also not allowed according to the Catholic teaching.
Wow. That's wild.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Even just things that were crossing my mind as you were describing all of that. Like, well, there's the classic men and their, weaponized incompetence that I know we talk about sometimes. I'm like, that could be wielded in such a way to maybe get out of something, I suppose. And then I was also just thinking,
it is absolutely
more humorous than anything. I do a lot of internal family systems and so parts work. And so like this question of, did I fully intentionally, knowingly, consensually engage in this thing? I suppose that really depends on all sorts of things. You could argue like, well, that was a part of me, but maybe myself didn't really. Anyway, again, more of a humorous sidebar. I could just see IFS really helping get out of some things and have some loopholes there. So.
Oh, it's helped me for sure. Yeah.
I love it. Now you did mention confession, and that actually is very interesting because I was curious, just in light of everything we're talking about and sexuality and the church, I am curious, what role do sacraments like confession or confirmation play in reinforcing or possibly resisting purity culture narratives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're talking about confession, or otherwise known as the sacrament of reconciliation. That's what the people that teach catechesis like to call it, because confession sounds really bad and potentially spiritually abusive and just not good. I mean, just to share from my end. So I was, I guess, maybe still in the state of being somebody who was an adult convert to Catholicism. My first confession, the priest told me to not identify with my sin as the resident gay. So you can tell that some people might have that sort of connection to, confession as being not so great of a thing. But there is actually a reason why the kind of the full name, and not just the nickname of that particular sacrament, is called the sacrament of reconciliation, because it's intended to reconcile that sinner, that bad sinner who's having oral sex. I know, terrible, the worst thing you could be doing. But it's not just to kind of reunite and reconcile that sinner back to Jesus, but also that sinful person back to the church. And so that's a carryover from Roman law. And actually, we see this in our current civil and criminal system, right? Civil law is about these potential torts, right? Cases, damages between two citizens. Whereas criminal law, you would have a state or county prosecutor on behalf of the state saying you committed other certain types of acts. And so now the state is saying on behalf of all of our citizens, we're kind of needing to put these two things together. So the Catholic Church thinks of sin in both of those ways, that local way and in that corporate way. And so that's why reconciliation is considered to be so important. And so when someone commits one of those big 3-part mortal sins, that's when somebody is obligated to then go to reconciliation. If you're sitting on a mortal sin in your life and you were to say, die, and without feeling this like full sense of repentance, there are all kinds of, again, it's Catholic, there's all kinds of ways out of this. But in general, if you were not fully repentant and you had mortal sin on your conscience, that's like a straight ticket to hell, basically. So you could imagine if somebody is kind of debating in that scrupulosity, was this a mortal sin or was it just grave matter? How that sense of always watching, like looking over your shoulder, is just going to become a part of how you think. When people talk about Catholic guilt, that's one of the things they're talking about.
That makes so much sense.
I mean, it's funny because it's like sometimes these words that we use, like Catholic guilt, it's, well, where does that really come from? Well, it comes from this kind of stuff. And especially because it often relates to sex, right? It's a thing that people don't really talk about in polite conversation. And it's your own personal sins. There's just a whole lot of haze and darkness and secrecy and a lack of transparency around some of these issues, which is why you might expect, the reconciliation is a place where people could be abused, physically or emotionally or spiritually, because that person in this culture of we don't talk about this and it's so bad you could go straight to hell for it. You could imagine how emotional and spiritual blackmail could come into play. And even if it's not with a priest, it's something that you're talking with accountability partners with, or maybe it's even with a priest, but not somebody who is your confessor. Well, this is what creates this whole issue within Catholicism of this massive abuse crisis. Everybody enters into a prisoner's dilemma, right? So if you were to tell one priest about, hey, I was looking at porn, again, the worst possible thing you could be doing, that priest might say, okay, well, that's really bad. But also this person is doing this other really bad thing. And you can't talk about that, and I won't talk about the bad thing you're doing. And this is part of what creates that problem. It's the guilt. It's these very specific definitions. It's the lack of a culture that has an openness and transparency about sex. And then, Andrew, kind of how do these other sacraments operate? Obviously, there are 7 sacraments in the Catholic Church. The other one I'm thinking of that's really important here is if you have mortal sin on your soul, in your conscience, you actually can't go receive the Eucharist. So, when you go to church and there's Mass and then eating the bread and the wine, you're not allowed to do that in a state of mortal sin. So you can imagine there's a social pressure if you're a Catholic, right? If maybe you and all of your friends, because you're good little Catholics, right? You go to your focus conferences and you come home, but maybe you looked with lust or something like that. And again, you're a very scrupulous Catholic, and so you think maybe that was a mortal sin. And so you can imagine you're just hyped up on all of your Catholic good stuff. So all of you and your friends go forward to receive the Eucharist, but because you're in this scrupulous place, you cross your arms over your chest and choose not to receive because you're just not sure. Now all your friends are thinking, what did that person do? What bad thing did they do because of that? And so there's this social pressure, just even going forward out of your pew to receive the Eucharist, of people looking and judging who's receiving and who's not. And that is its own kind of social pressure, either to one, lie about what you're doing, or two, get over your scrupulosity, or maybe even just choose not to care, right? And so even if you're doing something that's actually ethically wrong, to avoid that social embarrassment and that sort of hygiene factor, you would just kind of start telling yourself those things really aren't that bad. And again, if you're doing something that is actually pretty bad, you might just be training yourself to start lessening a conscience that was actually working for you.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And kind of leads into the next question, because, I think when we're talking about the social pressures, the isolation, the surveillance, like in any high control religion or any culture, like that can absolutely lead to deviant, illegal behavior, abuses, things like that. And, the Catholic Church is known for, their sex abuse scandals. I don't think there's any other way to say it. And so I just wonder if you can kind of speak a little bit to that. I know you said you were an adult convert, so you weren't, kind of living this, or I don't think you were living this as a kid growing up. But yeah, just kind of how that Catholic abuse crisis kind of shapes your understanding, or shapes people's understanding of sexual morality, power, accountability, kind of within that religious institution.
Yeah, I think really what you see are two different kinds of classes within the Catholic Church. You have, maybe in some ways you might call it an elite class for whom the rules don't apply. And then you have something like a true believers class. So I don't know if you all are familiar with Greg Thornberry, who used to be who got his PhD under Al Mohler, actually, and then now is living his best life doing other things.
Love it.
But has this very interesting take on something that he calls kayfabe theory. Kayfabe is the name for the whole act of professional wrestling, right? Where everybody that's going is aware that it's fake, but you certainly cannot talk about the fact that it's fake, right? So we might think of this as being sort of an elitist view of Catholic morality. Look, there's some things you're supposed to say from the ambo, not the pulpit, the ambo.
Okay.
And there's some things that you're supposed to be practicing, right? But just like with professional wrestling, that's just what you're supposed to say. There's not really fighting going on in professional wrestling. We're just saying there is.
Gotcha.
There's this other class of Catholics. We might call them like the true believers, right? They're the ones that are actually trying to live their lives in a good way, thinking that following all of these rules is actually what Jesus wants them to do. And so the problem comes about when that true believer runs into that sort of elite Catholic thing. Imagine this, this true believer, let's say that this pacifist stumbles into a professional wrestling match, right? This person's never heard of professional wrestling, and they see people beating each other up on stage. And that person saying, this is wrong. Stop the violence. Stop what's going on. But you see the problem, right? Everybody's in on this kind of big joke. If you go in saying, stop the violence is bad, you're actually ruining the whole thing. And so that's really where this kayfabe theory comes in, right? The problem is not this sense of Catholic elites breaking their own rules. The problem is true believers thinking that those rules apply to everybody, even the elites. So that's where we see this whole kind of breaking apart happen. There is a lot of bad things going on. I mean, my own story, when I was an adult convert, I came into the church, joined a Catholic ministry, and uncovered systemic abuse and saw how multiple archdioceses interacted with that. And their response was basically nothing besides protect their own. And I think that's really where it comes from. See, my whole problem as the silly queer person was that I was one of these true believers, right?
Yeah,
it was one of these funny things where I thought, I needed to not really even be queer if I was to follow Jesus, right? I was going to give that up and do all of the right things. And then I found out that people who I respected and looked up to and were ordained actually had a different set of rules. And I was the problem for thinking that those rules were actually what people needed to do.
Wow. So interesting.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And certainly the culture in Catholicism, I'm sure, is unique, but just that idea sounds so reminiscent of things I've heard folks say who came out of evangelicalism. Like, so often the ones who deconstructed the hardest and so forth were the ones who took it so seriously, like just so seriously, were so passionate and so like just, on fire and took their faith. Anyway, it sounds very similar to that. It's very interesting. You probably did already touch on this a little bit, but I want to ask this directly. What are some of the long-term impacts you've observed or experienced from Catholic purity culture and particularly those that aren't often named or talked about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because of how salient we might consider the Catholic culture to be, right? Because you have this deep tie into the calendar, right? Days of the week that you follow, specific stories. The fact that it really is an ancient church and there is a whole lot of culture that comes with it, Catholicism can really get in your bones. And so there's this sense that it isn't just like a belief that you hold, but it's a life that you really, really, really lead. And that is common in evangelical spaces too. But I think, and actually maybe some of our friends that kind of end up taking the Canterbury Trail, for instance, or end up going in this more liturgical direction, as those folks identify, as you start doing that more liturgical, embodied, holistic thing, well, I mean, it's like any other practice that when we engage all of our senses with, the more embedded those habits and practices tend to be. And because the Catholic Church is very much into that sort of thing, very much into these fully embodied practices that require so much of you, it is not a bench warming type of thing. I think people start to get those habits into their regular dealings with everyday life. You know, that same sense of how do I know if I'm actually doing the right thing, right? Maybe there's some rule that I'm breaking somewhere deep within the Summa Theologica that I hadn't heard of, but God's going to judge me for. All of these sorts of things that people may not realize actually is so deep inside of them that it's still part of this controlling narrative, right?
Yeah.
I think that is something that folks who are coming out of these things, and again, even with high control groups that are not Catholic or certain flavors of Protestantism, if you haven't taken the time to not just deconstruct, but also reconstruct, your body, your brain, your habits are going to go back to the things that are most deeply embedded, right? And so
Absolutely.
without knowing it, if you haven't recreated something new with all of those same fully embodied holistic practices, you're probably going to default to the things that were.
Yeah. I use a term called embodied fundamentalism, and I think it's what you're saying of like it being in your bones. And until you go to those spaces, regardless of the religion that you're coming out of, until you really address it on that physiological level, the cognitive stuff then is just replaced with something else that is potentially equally as fundamentalist, maybe just a different message that you're trying to promote or believe in.
That's 100% right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to shift our conversation a little bit because, I mean, I feel like we could go so much deeper into so many of these concepts within Catholicism, but I also want to kind of shift into talking about purity culture in the LGBTQ plus community. You've talked about that already a little bit, kind of being woven into your own story. And all of us with clients that we work with, of course, this is, you know, for many people, it's a huge part of their deconstruction process. It's a huge piece that they're working on with healing and resolving. So, yeah, I think maybe we can just kind of start with recognizing that, you know, when you are queer in a high control religious home or environment, there's a lot of very layered challenges that pop up. And so if we want to kind of tie that to purity culture, I wonder if you can kind of just speak to some of those unique purity culture messages that LGBTQ plus kids might receive, whether that is overtly or covertly.
Yeah, I think one of the things about, generally speaking, fundamentalist movements in general, whether that's a kind of Catholic fundamentalism or any sort of sexual ethic from any environment, even non-religious, that requires these very specific, stringent rules that don't relate to reality, you're going to have these same types of problems with dissonance, right? I think dissonance is really the word that's there. You're being told one thing, but the reality that you know and are living in is something entirely different. So what do you do then, specifically in this Christian concept of things, right? When you're being told that, well, actually, it's God's design for sex to be a certain way, for gender to be a certain way, right?
Yeah.
And then when people start telling you really, really intense things like, well, if you get gender wrong, if you get sexual orientation wrong, you're messing with the doctrine of the incarnation, right? If you start messing with your gender and become like a non-binary, like you are thoroughly messing up how we think of the resurrection of Jesus, right? They're going to, they're not male or female in heaven or whatever that verse says, but you're forgetting how God designed us in the Garden of Eden, right? You're messing up God's original plan if you decide to be queer. So it isn't just a matter of somebody saying, oh, well, if you're straight, and again, I always go back to the porn example because I feel like they always talk about porn.
I know. It's such a control thing. Yeah. I get it. Yeah.
But it's like, if you are straight and you look at straight porn, it's okay. Well, you're only human, right? Okay, don't do that. Go get Covenant Eyes on your computer and, do better.
Yeah.
But it's, to be queer is a different category of things. And actually, just because I love hating on Thomas Aquinas, because Thomas Aquinas has this whole section on what's rightly ordered and what's not, what Thomas Aquinas says is that cisgender rape is actually less bad than homosexual sex, where there are two people that are not forcing that on each other. Because for Thomas Aquinas, at least rape is ordered to a proper end, whereas homosexuality is not. That is still the Catholic position on things. And in fact, those scary parts of the catechism that talk about intrinsic disorder about queer people are based on the same Thomistic Aristotelian view of kind of the teleological side of human beings. So that's in there. And that's a key part of Catholic teaching, even if they don't talk about that specific quotation from Thomas Aquinas, because it's really about what are people supposed to be doing? What are they for, right? A chair is for sitting in. And if you're not using a chair that way, it's disordered, right? A penis is meant to go into a vagina. And if that's not happening, that is so wrong on so many levels and is breaking the creation order.
Yeah. Wow.
You can see how that's going to mess up so many people. I mean, in my case, as somebody who is both intersex and trans, you can imagine how me hearing so many of these things didn't make sense to me, right? It says somebody assigned a male at birth being told this is how we need to have sex. That doesn't actually work for me physiologically. So what do I do? Right?
Yeah.
Does the Catholic Church not have answers for me? Does the Catholic Church does God not have enough answers for one of his creations? So either that Catholic anthropology and theology is wrong, or the body that I have is wrong. And it certainly doesn't seem like the body I have doesn't it's not like a black hole, right?
Yeah.
It's there.
There. Yeah.
And queerness is like that across the board, right? It's like this idea, and for Roman Catholics, the idea that within this purity culture concept, that if you're bi or if you're gay, what your mind is doing is something that is so wrongly ordered that so many things need to happen to get it right, whether that's a mixed orientation marriage or even conversion therapy. And what you're being told is these desires that feel as natural to you as your straight friends, hitting puberty and getting crushes, those things that are often so common for many people are wrong. You're going to start questioning everything that you think comes naturally to you. It's just how purity culture worms into every part of your body, right? So even if your church isn't saying, oh, you like vanilla ice cream, that's bad. The fact that comes to you internally, the same way that who you're attracted to you comes to you internally, everything is up for grabs. Nothing is stable. Nothing is secure. And you can't trust yourself at that fundamental level.
Yeah. Oh, it's devastating. And and you're not even, like you said, you're not even told that, but you know that. It's felt.
Yeah.
It's on such a deep level.
Yeah. Well, the next question that I had, I think you very much just spoke to it actually, but there is one aspect specifically, and that is just in light of the teachings that the church has given that LGBTQ plus folks are told that their very existence is impure or is what was the word?
Unnatural.
You used the word
intrinsic disorder. Yeah.
Disorder.
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
disorder. Yes, the intrinsic disorder. You certainly spoke to how that affected your relationship, with your body, your sexuality. I'm curious, with your spirituality, how did that affect your spirituality?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those funny things where looking back now is honestly kind of fun, because I think, and this took a long time and a lot of therapy to get out of, but what I've discovered is actually the heart is not deceitful above all else. And in fact, the heart that was telling me to stand up for those who were abused by this systemic culture in the Catholic Church, the same heart that's telling me, hey, there are types of ways that you engage with other people that are actually bad, despite the fact that I saw preachers and pastors and priests doing that. I mean, this will sound, and I love saying things that kind of self-select some folks out if they are just here to look to find ammo, right? So I'm going to say something that will filter people out, and I hope it works. I'm actually better than that. My ethics are stronger than that, right? And you could put up the stuff that I've done against bishops, against priests, against so-called spiritual leaders. And I think for the folks that haven't been sorted out by me saying something so presumptuous as that, folks who might be thinking that for themselves, actually, wait a second, I've seen a lot of really bad things. And despite the fact those religious leaders are pointing at Bible verses, I actually think that what they're doing is wrong and abusive and bad. Trust your heart is all I can say. I think what Andrew was talking about, like, what about my spirituality? Well, I think my spirituality has always been one that is in some sense pastoral, whether or not that's been like going and becoming a nun. They wouldn't let me do that. But like that sense of wanting to be there with people, to partner with them, to work with them has always been a part of my spiritual identity, more core to me than Christianity or Catholicism was. And so when I was running into the abuse crisis, when I was running into issues of my own gender and sexuality, ultimately what ended up winning in the end was really who I am deep down spiritually. And I think it's that integration is what for me is a stronger proof than Thomas Aquinas or a specific Bible verse, because it's ultimately the proof of one's life and how they're working for the good of other people that shows if their spirituality is consistent with the words they're speaking and the actions that they're taking, right? You will know a tree by its fruits, right? And so I think if that's the case, my spirituality is stronger than it's ever been. Now, the thing is, I realize that I've always had this sort of true believer part of me. And so it's like, I have to, like Laura said, you have to keep that in check. Fundamentalism gets in your bones. And so you have to always be looking out for this sort of specter that's haunting you, which is fundamentalism. And so for me, it's okay. How can I live into a liberatory ethic that isn't just based on, I need to find some rules, right? I've left the Christian rules. What's the new rule I can follow? What's the most enlightened rule I can follow? And it's actually about something else. And I think if there's anything about my spirituality that's shifted, it's less about, okay, do I know that I have the right rule set? And it's more about, is there this cohesive way of being, a sociological imaginary, a set of tools that I'm using to live out my life? And that even though, like how you asked the question, Andrew, I think is right. Like, that is my spirituality. But is it based in a particular religious system that I've changed to? It's not really so much in that sense. And I think if I can say this to folks who might be navigating this themselves, you don't have to lose spirituality to be honest to yourself. Yeah, it just may shift and change. You might even still be Christian at the end of it. But just know that the heart is not deceitful above all else. And if it's guiding you to do the right things materially and ethically, trust that before you trust a Bible verse.
Yeah. And I think what you're speaking to there is like the idea that spirituality is not necessarily connected to religion. Like, you are a spiritual being with a soul that may happen to engage with religious practices, but they're not like a one-to-one equal, is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
That's totally
right. That's where you can trust yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I love that. Well, as we're talking about purity culture and even looking outside of just religious spaces, I wonder if you see forms of purity culture in secular spaces as we're talking about things like queerness, trans identity, what is respectable or what is, what you're supposed to do or not supposed to do, even in non-religious spaces.
Yeah. So I feel like I have a lot of special interests that are coming up in this conversation, and ethics is one of those things.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about, I like to use this term sexual ethics, and it is one that evangelicals happen to use, but they also happen to use other words in English. And so I'm not going to give up those words either. So I think having a sexual ethic is important. And again, like I said, if you are not just deconstructing, if you are only deconstructing and not reconstructing, you're going to do a lot of default things. And so I think it's very important, just as you would reconstruct ethics about, how one engages in the workplace or how one engages in relationships, specifically having a sexual ethic that is well-examined is important too. I think when you're asking, is there a way that fundamentalism kind of reaches its tendrils even into these non-religious spaces? I think the answer is for sure, yes. I think one way that we might see that is within kind of a reemergence of a kind of, we might say something that is a inheritor of second wave feminism, right? Where there's this sense of choice feminism and choice sexual ethics, right? So we've talked a lot about pornography. Now I'm going to say something that will sound contradictory, but not all porn is good, right? Just because porn is out there and that feels liberatory if you're coming from a Christian mindset, Not all
Right.
porn is good, actually. In fact, a lot of the free stuff you might find online has been ripped from places where people were making their income from, or people have, or it's revenge pornography and things like that. And so there's this sense of it. You can be one step removed from Christianity and still be doing some bad stuff, right? And so if one is not examining, say, their consumerism habits about sex or things like that, because they're just saying, well, at least I'm not Christian, right? It's fine now because I'm not Christian. I'm doing choice sexual ethics now. I'm choosing this, and so I'm empowered automatically. So that's actually not how that works. We need to be aware that our sexual ethic has to understand power dynamics, has to understand the role of consumerism in our society and how that comes to be, and how people might do things that they don't necessarily want to do, and they're being exploited potentially by you in the name of, liberation and things like that. But I think a truly liberatory ethic, not one that's just sort of a reactionary fundamentalism, is one that examines those things from that deeper perspective, right? So you might ask then, okay, what does that look like? I'm not going to give you Wayne Grudem. There isn't like a thing that you can read to learn how to do a liberatory thing. But I think what this comes down to is, one, using the sort of mental shortcut, a heuristic of saying, am I just doing something reactionary? Sometimes that can be good, right? If your church said gay people are bad, react the exact opposite from that, right? Please be reactionary. Gay people are pretty cool. But I think this is where we have to have nuance, right? So you might leave evangelical sexual ethics or Catholic sexual ethics and say, okay, the only sex that's good is P and V, a cisgender man, cisgender woman in the context of a marriage. Okay, you leave that behind, and then you might just say, well, I've heard that consent is good. Okay, consent is what makes sex moral and ethical. And it's, well, no, actually, this is still kind of within this realm of like choice sexual ethics, this kind of only one step removed. Consent is only one part of what might make sex good, right? It isn't just harm avoidance, right? It's pleasure, it's intimacy, it's integration. And I think that those are all things that pleasure, intimacy, and integration are what separate good ethical sex from these abusive forms of Christian sex. Not just because it's not Christian, but because it's integrated, because it's intimate, because it's based in pleasure.
Yes, that's so helpful. Yeah, I love that answer. And kind of like naturally leads into what the final topic that we were wanting to get to was really sexual ethics. And so leading from that, I wonder if we can take a step back and just kind of look at a definition, like when you say sexual ethic, because I think a lot of people coming out of purity culture, we have quote unquote boundaries, which are really just rules. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. But a sexual ethic is so much more than that. So when you say sexual ethic, what does that mean? And how is that different than purity culture?
Yeah, if I were to describe what sexual ethics is about, I would say it's pleasure-focused and care-centered. And that's not going to cover everything, but that will cover some of the basics, like consent. That will cover some of the basics. What does it look like to have integration in one's own life and in their interactions with others? I think those are things that we want to think about. What is the bad we want to avoid in terms of making sort of ethical frameworks? But we also want to be looking at what's working in terms of what's taking us in a positive direction, right? When I talk about things like love and intimacy and desire, I like to talk about it's more than just what's driving us at one level, say a chemical level, but it's actually diving deeper into ourselves, right? Which is where I think queerness is so helpful, right? We talk about attraction, right? So many folks who have only had one view of what sexuality and attraction looks like, it's kind of rolled into one thing called sexual attraction, right? But there are so many different kinds of attractions that I think queerness can help highlight. There are romantic attractions. There are sort of erotic attractions that aren't just sexual attractions. There are sexual attractions, but then you can even break those down. Is this a chemical or hormonal attraction? Is this something else entirely? And I think that's where, as we dive deeper into ourselves, we not only learn more about ourselves, but the people around us, right? So what might work in terms of a consent is the only thing that really matters type of ethic, we might realize that there's actually other things for specific people and our specific interactions with them that aren't pleasure-focused and care-centered, right? Maybe it's not care-centered because of a particular thing that one enjoys that's traumatic for that other person, right? Maybe pleasure-focused is somebody saying, I need to actually make a choice for myself. We've probably many of us have seen people who end up getting divorces or leaving their partners after being together in purity culture. And even though to an evangelical, they're saying divorce is bad, that pleasure-focused and care-centered thing might be divorce, right? So we have to be creative in how we're thinking about this ethic. I wish there was like one strong definition or dictionary term we could use. I don't know that there is one, but I think centering desire and rightly ordered desire at its core is what can make a big difference. Now, it's not rightly ordered in the sense of like the Thomas Aquinas Aristotle thing. It's rightly ordered in that it directly cares for humans and not caring about specific ways of doing ancient Greek philosophy and trying to shoehorn diverse, beautiful, incredible, different human beings into this sort of classical philosophy thing.
I love that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I can say just anecdotally, like both in terms of like my own experience, but like folks I have worked with professionally, just speaking in generalities, like I have seen a lot of the emphasis on consent in the sexual ethic, but that being like the predominant focal point at the expense of everything else. And so that there's still, I have noticed, can still be quite a block or quite a challenge in navigating things like pleasure without lots of like shame coming up, for example. That's, it's folks who've come out of purity culture. I think that's a pretty common thing. But so I just appreciate you speaking to that, because that is something that I see a lot in these spaces. By these spaces, I mean the deconstructed post-purity culture spaces, and folks that are trying to navigate and heal from all of this harm that's happened. Now, I think you did answer some of this question, but I do want to just, ask it very directly. What would you say, like, what core values guide your approach to sexuality now, especially like in light of having survived both religious trauma and queer phobia?
Yeah, I think there are two sides of the same coin. One is that what is sort of giving me life in that space post all of those not so great things is thinking about liberation and not just autonomy. And here's what I mean by that. Autonomy is sort of the freedom to do things that you want, right? And you might do a very autonomous way of sex after leaving Christianity, for instance. But that may not be liberatory for other people, right? In the same way that if you're kind of getting over a maybe very evangelical way of serving other people to the point of not caring for yourself, you might say, okay, time for autonomy. And then you stop giving a shit about anything else around you. Well, that's not good either. Yes, it's good to break away from this kind of obsessive sense of like service or things like that evangelicalism can teach people. But just being autonomous doesn't make you a good person. And I think this liberatory approach, a truly liberatory approach, is one that's going to require self-sacrifice to some degree, right? To be a good person to be an ethical person is going to mean having to do things that don't always make sense to you. It may mean needing to do things that are inconvenient for you. It may mean needing to give up some things that you might actually want for the sake of helping other people. And I think when we think about, say, sexual relationships after leaving purity culture, and I have to have full disclosure here, this sort of like sexual debut thing is relatively new for me. It's just one of these like fun things where it's like I'm not an expert in the sense of the thing of all of this kind of stuff. But really one of the things that I've discovered in coming out of this, just from my own perspective, with my limited perspective, is that liberatory part is its own sort of pleasure when it comes to trying to make sense of other people, right? Especially others who are coming out of purity culture, other queer people, trans folks who are maybe trying to understand the body that they think that to have a body that inside of yourself that isn't physically appearing to other people is strange and different. And that might be strange and different for you, but in a sexual encounter, that to have the liberatory openness to that can be a way that you can learn pleasure, even if you feel like you're on your back foot, because you don't exactly know what to do here. But that curiosity, that openness is important. I think that leads to the other side of this coin, is that I actually believe in a kind of revived hedonism. And that's actually not as scary as that sounds. In fact, actually, John Piper and C.S. Lewis agree with me.
That was immediately what I thought of was John Piper.
Somebody's read Desiring God. Somebody's read
too many times. Yeah.
But what John Piper gets wrong is, well, everything. But this idea that the only thing that really works for humans is desire, I think is basically true. I don't think that because, John Piper says that. I think that because Judith Butler says stuff like that. And if we take something more of this like Butlerian approach, is that many of us look for mirrors in our lives to know what to do, right? So, Butler's idea of gender performativity is a lot like that, right? We have mirrors and then we reflect onto those things and they reflect back onto us. And that creates this sort of iterative way of doing a thing, like performing gender, for instance. But that mirrored approach, when in the presence of the other, another person, and thinking about this from the perspective of the one intrinsic motivator we have, desire. And there's more than that, but I'm saying that hyperbolically. To focus and to rightly order hedonism and desire is to find within you a source that is almost tireless and that's relentless for doing the right thing. If you can order that sort of hedonistic impulse to whether it's liberatory sexual encounters or to serving the needy in your community or to volunteering or to studying or to helping others or yourself, right? If you're doing something because you're trying to look good for another person, you're going to run out of steam. If you're doing something because you're scared of hell, you're going to run out of steam. If you're doing something because there's this internal desire impulse directing you there, that's going to provide you with so much more motivation to do the difficult things, to do the things that are not as inspiring to you, to step out of your comfort zone. And I think really in some ways, specifically about sex, I think that stepping out of a comfort zone can actually be a very healing thing for many people coming out of purity culture. The Catholic thing is, here's what you need to do. Penis into vagina. There you go. Yeah. What happens if you start navigating ethical non-monogamy, right?
Sure.
What happens if you start navigating, T for T relationships, trans and trans relationships together, right? Scary, different. Yeah. But you're unlocking a whole other world that you can learn about yourself and others in this liberatory and desire-focused direction.
I know, Andrew, you brought up internal family systems, and as you were talking, Willow, so one of the core pieces of internal family systems, or IFS, is that there's no bad part, right? And so sometimes parts will hijack situations or they'll kind of be habituated into specific behaviors and things like that. But at their core, they're good because there's this reason that this part exists. And what I'm hearing you talk about, even with this different shift of hedonism, is going, hey, we maybe have these like hedonistic parts to us. And what it was really created for was like goodness, essentially, like being like desiring of goodness and learning and curiosity and things like that. But perhaps like a high control religion comes in and like usurps that and focuses that part towards a religious hedonism, essentially, and how we don't have to get rid of that. We just redirect that. That's kind of what I'm thinking as you're talking about that.
I think that's right. And yeah, part of the fun really is that journey of redirection.
Yes.
I think many of us feel the pull of that desire to do things, even the difficult things. And I think linking that to what could come from relationships and sex, right? Closeness with others, intimacy, bonds that are like very, very strong. Something that's sacred about that in a kind of a different guilt-focused way than religion might tell us in many cases. But those are all things that I think many of us, to whatever degree they apply to us, and again, not just about sex, not just about romance, but about these other sides of being compelled by another include, I think unlocking one's own desire is unlocking so many other areas of getting to know others and oneself. So why not pursue that?
I love that. Yeah. If you are thinking or talking to somebody, maybe it's a client or somebody who's listening to this podcast who's, deconstructing but feels that sense of fear or guilt or distress around desire, what would you offer to them?
Yeah, I mean, I've been through IFS therapy and I feel like I'm very informed by that. And I think learning to appreciate whatever that thing was, even if it came from not so great of a source, to think about how that can be transformed to the thing that somebody really, really wants, right? Like I said, I use this specific example of like very sort of conscientious evangelical service. I feel like that's just sort of how I've been wired and how religious organizations have kind of manipulated that. And now thinking about how that could work in some, different scenarios, whether that's just general interpersonal relationships or even things like sex, right? I think to understand the impulse first and to trust it is an important thing. Just from my own story, I thought that maybe I'm just like this extremely repressed person. And that's why I was like trying to do good things and be a good person. And that was one of the first things I needed to kind of break apart. Somehow I got through that and decided, actually, I think I just am sort of like a good-natured, conscientious person. And that can be hard to break apart when there is a whole lot of fundamentalist-driven conscientiousness. That is still a thing I work through today. But it's not as if it's noise and in confusion to realize that about myself, right? I just can go on this creative journey of trying to understand that better and direct that towards a thing that works for other people and myself. So I think for folks that are trying to reconnect with desire in a way that works for them, it really is stepping into that internal motivation, sometimes working through how it got hijacked, but then learning to trust, appreciate, love, find really, really cool and awesome, whatever that thing is about themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the fun thing. I mean, my own journey in terms of like identity, I've used lots of different labels over the years. It might ebb and flow. There might be some things that change. And so not only is it a matter of, learning to thank and love and appreciate that desire, but enjoying the journey of seeing how that desire might be sort of fluid, how it might come and go, how it might change, how there might be some kinds of desires that you're not even into at all. That's just a fun part of the journey, but that really comes with trusting yourself and appreciating yourself first. I think that's really kind of the way in.
I love that.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. Well, I still have a couple questions that I definitely want to ask. So shifting gears just a little bit, some of these are a little more reflective type questions, but I'm so curious if you could go back and say one thing to your younger self in the midst of purity culture messaging. I'm just curious what that might be.
Yeah. I think about this question because probably like many queer folks, you can point to specific points in your life where you really run into like a fork in the road type moment. And I feel like I might have different little quips I might tell myself depending on which fork in the road I've found myself in. But I think the one common theme that I feel emerge from that is, this will sound so trite, but it really is this: you are enough and you are good.
I love that. That's not trite. It's powerful.
But that's the thing. It's so much of what you get told in those environments is the exact opposite.
Yes.
If you're from a Reformed environment, you feel that one. If you're from a Catholic environment, you feel that one. But to know that you are actually good, to know that you are actually enough, even with a body that might feel sort of broken, because maybe if you're queer, maybe if you're trans, if you're intersex, it might not feel that way. It might not sound that way. But again, you're asking what I would say to myself looking back then with what I know now. Even so, it's good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Peter Levine, who's a trauma, kind of guru or whatever, talks about like the whole point of healing trauma is to come back home to your inherent goodness. And that is one of my favorite lines ever, because it like flies so boldly in the face of fundamentalism and religion that tries to teach you the opposite. And healing is going, no, you've always been good. There never was anything wrong with you. It's just coming back home so you can remember that too. And so when you say trite, I'm like, oh, no, that is actually so powerful. And I think so many people need to hear that. I think our last question that we have for you is kind of going back to this, idea of communities of faith. And this is a sticky one. I think especially when we're talking about sexual ethics, especially when we're talking about the LGBTQ community, how do you think that communities of faith or even healing communities can help to repair the harm that purity culture has done?
Yeah, I mean, this is the funny thing. Depending on which contexts I find myself in, some people think I'm like extremely like a devout Christian or something, and in some contexts, I feel like people might walk away thinking that I'm like anti-religion to like a Richard Dawkins degree or something, hopefully without the turfism. But really, what I'm into is not really kind of either extreme, but I'm into things that work for people, that help them get those desires in order. And I think what's interesting about religion is that so many religions have these deep, strong mythologies and these deep, enduring stories that have compelled so many of the most heroic people in the world to do those heroic things. And I think that even if one, say, didn't have or develop or have a desire to develop a faith, right, there's still something so powerful about what a religious community can offer by being sort of the bearer of particular mythologies, particular stories. And so I think there's actually a way of recovering some of those primary locations of guilt through that religious mythological lens. What does that mean? It's all very abstract. Well, I think, for example, one of the most powerful Christian mythologies is the mythology around communion or the Eucharist. This will sound weird, but the idea that some external being, right, has taken a part of itself to come down and do something liberatory to people. Because we all know that stuff is kind of messed up, right? Even if we're all fundamentally good, there's all kinds of stuff that's messed up. And so to have some sense of the divine enter into our place, our space as we are, and then that divine thing returns to that divinity and says, I'm going to take you with me, and I'm going to give you a little piece of this that you can remember this promise I'm making. That's kind of what the Eucharist is. I think that vision of that is something that can be very powerful in recovering a guilt-free kind of sex. I mean, if you think about self-gift, embodiment, metabolizing parts of another person, that's sex. Like, that's sex. I think the mythology around the incarnation and self-gift, kenosis, things like that, you can find powerful parallels in those type of sexual situations. I wrote a poem about this. I was giving somebody, after an encounter, an estrogen pill, and they held out their hands, two hands, one on top of the other. And as somebody who's distributed communion, that scene
so similar.
was exactly that. There was this self-giving and maybe even a deeper way that I don't think I'd ever experienced before.
Yeah.
And what that showed me was all of these mythologies that were so powerful to me then returned to me and gave me, honestly, a life-changing experience.
Wow.
Now, if there's deep trauma and any talk of the Eucharist or communion is not good for you, don't go that route. That's fine. But to know that there are other deep mythologies and stories that you could pull from that are not Christian, for instance, could be ways of recovering that and finding archetypes to make sense of, say, relationships with others or sex or things like that. I think religious communities could give that gift, right? If they can do their part to avoid sort of ex-gay ministries, including things like side B ministries, if they can work through the historical anti-queer, anti-woman, anti-liberation parts of their, of unfortunately, that's been fundamental parts of many religions, there is something so good that can be recovered that I think can be so powerful in people's deconstruction, reconstruction, and the refinding of these very strong, powerful, and good desires.
Yeah. I really appreciate your take on that because I think it's so... I think it's like almost natural that when we're rejecting, it's like you got to reject everything. And that's it. It's a big loss. I mean, for so many reasons, right? And so to hear your hopefulness of, hey, there's parts of these mythologies that could be reconstructed, that could be healing, that could be things like sources of, groundedness and tethering in your life. And I would imagine like that I would hope that people would hear that as a hopeful message because it's not about just, the black and white rejection, good or bad, right? It's about kind of seeing the nuances and the complexities and what's like the essence of this and how can we move that forward. And I don't know, I just think that's really beautiful.
If I can say to that, I think if people know some of my background and stories, I really don't have a right to be Pollyanna-ish about things, but I will be so for real. Nothing has made me shake that hope that I have for human beings. for that fundamental goodness. And again, there's been a lot of stuff in my story that I think would give me more than the right to not think that way. And even so, I think that those deep, strong, abiding narratives that need to be kind of redeemed from some bad stuff, I can borrow their term. I think that can provide us with that sort of foot in the door of getting through trauma, getting through embarrassment, getting through guilt, because there's probably something on the other side, right? Whether that's a reconstitution of all things or, becoming a part of the universe, whatever that is. I haven't lost that, and I really believe that, which is why I do the work that I do. And that's the basis of it. It's not hopeless. It's actually based on the fact that, look, if I can survive fundamentalism and all the other shit and still make it, look, it can happen. It can happen. And I think that it can happen for others too. And there is hope, and there's a reason to try.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much.
Yeah. Well, Willow, it has been so lovely to have you here. I just want to ask, if people are wanting to connect with you more, maybe social media or working with you, where can they find you? And we'll make sure to put it all in the show notes too.
Absolutely. Well, you can always go to the center's website, and you can schedule an inquiry call with me there if you want to talk about some of these things in the context of coaching. I do some writing on issues related to fundamentalism, to conversion therapy, and queer topics at my website, spotlightonsociety.com. That is a fun little Substack blog where you can see more of these types of musings. But really, I mean, it's kind of like what I was saying. What I really care about is like seeing other people find hope despite the negative things, despite anti-queerness and things like that. So hopefully when people find whatever that is they're looking for on social media or those writings, they'll see that too. And that's really what I hope people get out of that and this conversation too.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been so lovely. I know we hit a lot of different topics, and I feel like all of them could have warranted their own episode, So thank you for, tracking with us and going fast. But it's been lovely to have you here. And we'll put all of your information in the show notes so people can connect with you. Yeah, Andrew, anything else?
No, I just really appreciate you being here, speaking with us today. It's really been great. I've really appreciated it.
Well, it's been really fun. Thank you both so much.
Yes, thanks for stopping by and being a Sunday school dropout. Once again, thank you so much to Willow Sipling for joining us today for such a wonderful conversation. Was really glad to be able to talk to her about all things purity culture and Catholicism, and am excited for the work that she's doing. So if you want to get in touch with Willow, work with her, follow her along her journey, check out the show notes, and get in touch. I think that's it, Andrew. How are you feeling?
Yeah, no, I think that is it. It was a great conversation. So check that out, everybody.
Yeah, love it. All right. And with that, all God's people said, amen.
Amen.